On a sunny February afternoon in South Florida, 35-year-old Gwendolyn Greenblatt chatted on her cell phone while walking up to her apartment, unaware that danger lurked behind her front door. Even the friend on the other end of the line had no way of stopping the evil that awaited Gwen at her West Palm Beach residence. It was close to 3:30 in the afternoon on Wednesday, February 5, 2003, when Christina was talking on the phone with her friend Gwendolyn Greenblatt. The two women had been catching up as Gwen made the 20-minute drive home from her job as a massage therapist at the luxurious Breakers Resort in Palm Beach. Christina and Gwen had met through their work at the spa, but had grown increasingly close as both women's marriages deteriorated. Gwen had recently told Christina that she would soon be in the same situation, going through a divorce, and that they would support each other through their respective separations. The impending divorce was actually the topic of conversation that day as Gwen arrived at the Royal St. George apartment complex and approached Unit 8-12, where she lived alone, continuing her phone conversation with Christina. Christina knew that Gwen had attended a therapy appointment that day, so she was checking in to provide support during this emotionally difficult period. Christina was discussing her therapy session and what her therapist had told her when their conversation came to a sudden and chilling halt. Gwen let out a huge scream, and Christina heard her dog barking, indicating that Gwen had arrived home. Christina knew that Gwen lived on the top floor and had to climb very steep outside stairs to reach her third-floor apartment. When Christina heard the scream and dog barking, she initially thought Gwen had grabbed the leash to take her dog for a walk and had fallen down the stairs. Christina waited on the phone, repeatedly asking Gwen to pick up, but heard nothing more. The dog stopped barking. Gwen made no sounds, but Christina could tell the phone connection remained active. She then called Gwen's home phone on her cell phone, linking all their lines together. Gwen's old-style answering machine picked up, and Christina could hear herself through the phone talking and leaving a message. Christina urgently told Gwen to pick up the phone, explaining that she was scared and worried. She warned that if Gwen did not respond, she would call the police, but still received no response. Christina was not making empty threats. Hearing nothing from the other end of the line, she immediately called 911 and provided Gwen's address while waiting at her own home, 30 to 40 minutes away, for an update. The waiting was torturous. Knowing first responders were on their way, Christina called their mutual friend Sarah, who lived closer, and asked her to go to Gwen's apartment to determine what was happening. Sarah quickly gathered her children and drove to the location. By the time Sarah arrived, police and emergency personnel were already on scene. Authorities initially prevented her from entering, explaining it was a crime scene. When Sarah insisted that Gwen was one of her best friends, police began questioning her. Sarah apparently asked what he had done to Gwen, prompting police to ask whom she was referencing. When Sarah mentioned Gwen's husband, officers seemed surprised to learn that Gwen was married, and Sarah clarified that she was separated. Sarah witnessed paramedics bringing Gwen out on a gurney while they were still working to save her life. All Sarah could see was the side of Gwen's head, which appeared severely damaged. Despite the horrific sight, Sarah maintained hope that they would be talking again in a few hours when Gwen recovered at the hospital. She asked an officer to tell Gwen that she was there, but the officer began to suggest that Gwen would not be aware of her presence. As investigators suspected, Gwen had not suffered an accidental fall down the apartment stairs. West Palm Beach police immediately recognized that she had been shot. Detective Aaron Sam, currently working the case, described how officers found Gwen when they arrived at the scene. Officers discovered the door slightly ajar and immediately noticed items scattered on the floor, including a sweater, shoe, keys, and cell phone. They called out but heard little response. In the small apartment, two officers eventually found Gwen moaning in a closet where she had collapsed, sitting in a laundry basket. She had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one to the face and one through the top of her head. Investigator William Frazier, currently with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, but who worked closely with Detective Sam on Gwen's case, characterized the shooting as an assassination-style killing. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and nothing appeared to have been stolen from the apartment. Whoever shot Gwen seemed to have had the sole objective of killing her. The evidence suggested that Gwen had been chased and cornered at the back of her apartment with nowhere else to escape when she was shot. Personal items were scattered throughout the apartment, with the most significant being the sweater on the floor. The sweater had been turned inside out, indicating that someone had grabbed Gwen from behind as she tried to flee, causing her to run out of the garment with the sleeves turning inside out. Investigators theorized that Gwen had run in the wrong direction, heading toward a dead end rather than toward the outside of the apartment, which might have saved her life. The shooting occurred in the back closet where Gwen was found. She had dropped her cell phone at the front door, which might explain why Christina heard nothing else after the initial scream and dog barking. Police found Gwen's Jack Russell Terrier, Shaquille, unharmed and wandering the apartment with his leash attached. Detectives surmised that Gwen had likely put the leash on immediately upon arriving home, in the brief moments before she was ambushed. This detail suggested something important to her friends. The dog was likely familiar with whoever had been waiting for Gwen. Shaquille was not a friendly dog and was very protective of Gwen. The dog would bark at visitors and was generally not welcoming to strangers. The fact that the dog was not injured and did not appear to have interfered with the attack suggested the perpetrator was someone the animal knew. The primary evidence found around Gwen in the closet consisted of bullet casings from a .380 caliber weapon. While the gun itself was not left behind, investigators discovered other significant evidence outside the apartment. A police officer noted that when they were transporting Gwen to the hospital, they found a cigarette butt on a box, housing a fire alarm pole directly outside her door that was still burning. There were only 3 other apartments on that floor, and no one else appeared to be around during the time of the murder. Most residents typically smoked on their balconies rather than in the outside area where this cigarette was located, making it seem likely that it belonged to the killer. An additional extinguished cigarette butt was found on the ground below the first one, which also appeared to be relatively fresh when discovered. While police response was fast enough to find the still smoking cigarette before it burned out, no one could have responded quickly enough to save Gwen. She died from the gunshot wounds to her head shortly after being transported to the hospital. The news of her death devastated her friends Sarah and Christina, who had been praying for her recovery. Ever since Sarah had arrived at the crime scene, both women had been attempting to contact Gwen's loved ones. Gwen's family in her home state of Pennsylvania received word of the incident and immediately traveled to South Florida. Gwen's only family in the immediate area was her husband of approximately 5 years, Matthew Greenblatt, who went by Matt, from whom she was separated. They had been living apart for several years, but according to those who knew them, Gwen had wanted to work things out and save their marriage. Matt, however, appeared to have different intentions. He seemed to be leading her on, keeping her emotionally connected while having no intention of actually recommitting to the relationship. Sarah reported that Matt's controlling and manipulative behavior had been pushing Gwen to a breaking point. The day before her murder, Gwen had told Sarah that she was going to take decisive action regarding her marriage. During a phone conversation, Gwen became increasingly upset, which was unusual for her typically calm demeanor. She finally began crying and told Sarah that she could not tolerate the situation anymore. Gwen explained that she had told Matt she was going to consult with an attorney about the divorce. When Sarah asked how Matt had responded, Gwen revealed that he had threatened to kill her if she proceeded with legal action. She was dead at 3:30 the following day. It remains unclear who contacted Matt to notify him about the incident, but Gwen's friends estimated that he arrived at the hospital within approximately 2 hours of the shooting, seemingly unaware of what had occurred. Investigators were already informed about the couple's troubled relationship, so they were curious to observe Matt's reaction when they informed him that Gwen had been murdered. According to investigators, Matt never displayed any emotional response to the news of his wife's death. He accepted the information that she had been shot and killed without showing grief or distress. He initially cooperated fully with the investigation, but communications became difficult when Detective Donnie Mon conducted a thorough interview and discovered discrepancies in Matt's various accounts of his whereabouts during the time of the murder. Matt provided multiple conflicting stories about his activities, claiming he was getting pizza, then getting a haircut, then renting a video. Investigators were unable to verify or substantiate any of his alibis. Despite learning of his wife's violent death, Matt never began crying or showing typical signs of grief. He simply accepted that she was dead, leading investigators to believe he already knew about her death. Detectives were never able to locate anyone who could confirm Matt's whereabouts during the time Gwen was killed. At least some versions of his story were completely unverifiable. When he claimed to have gotten a haircut, investigators found no record of him signing in at the establishment he mentioned. When he claimed to have visited Hungry Howie's to pick up food, they could not verify that either, as the Florida locations of this national chain did not maintain the records that would have been needed for verification. Authorities obtained and executed a search warrant at Matt's residence within the first week of the investigation. but they discovered nothing connecting him to the crime. However, they also found nothing that definitively excluded him from involvement, such as clear phone activity during the relevant time period. Analysis of Matt's phone and computer data revealed that he was typically very active on these devices consistently throughout the day. However, there was a notable period of inactivity right around the time of the homicide, creating a suspicious gap in his usual patterns of electronic communication. Through examination of his electronic devices, detectives discovered that Matt was having multiple affairs with exotic dancers, something he had not disclosed when initially asked about the status of his marriage. These were not casual encounters, but ongoing relationships with at least 4 different women. Detectives interviewed several of these women, all of whom stated they had no idea they had been dating a married man. While Matt was separated from Gwen, he was still legally married. These women painted an unflattering picture of Matt, describing him as emotionally abusive, controlling, and jealous, constantly monitoring their activities and whereabouts. However, none of them claimed to have any knowledge about or insight into his wife's murder. The more investigators learned about Matt and Gwen's relationship, the more suspicious they became of his potential involvement. Gwen's younger brother, Chad, had been aware of problems in his sister's marriage almost from the beginning. He clearly remembered that shortly after Gwen and Matt married, she discovered that Matt was cheating on her. Chad recalled Gwen calling their mother in a frantic state, prompting their mother to fly to Florida to console her daughter. From that point forward, Matt and Gwen lived separately while attempting to work things out. Chad had numerous conversations with his sister, during which he questioned when she would give up on the relationship, feeling that enough was enough. He later regretted not pushing harder for her to end the marriage, though he acknowledged that at 23 years old, he was still young himself. While Gwen's family heard about her difficulties with Matt through phone calls and occasional visits, her Florida friends had front row seats to the ongoing drama. Despite all of Matt's affairs, he still wanted to keep Gwen available to him. She was not allowed to move on with her life, but he maintained complete freedom to do whatever he wanted. Matt had made his own key to Gwen's apartment and would enter when she was not home, sitting in the dark waiting for her to return. Gwen would turn on the lights to find him sitting there. Whenever Gwen was with friends, she would receive constant phone calls from Matt. Sometimes she would ignore the calls, but when she did answer, her friends could hear him yelling at her. Even though they were separated, investigators learned that Gwen and Matt were still seeing each other occasionally. Matt told them that they had been intimate just a few days before the homicide, though this claim came only from Matt himself. However, as Sarah had observed, any ambivalence Gwen had been feeling about Matt, and the marriage appeared to be over. Gwen had told Sarah definitively that she was done with the back-and-forth relationship and wanted out of the marriage completely. This situation provided clear motive, especially when investigators learned about the financial aspects of their relationship. Matt and Gwen had a prenuptial agreement in place. Detectives learned that Matt claimed the agreement was his family's idea, as they were apparently quite wealthy. However, Matt stood to lose money in the event of a divorce. Gwen had brought approximately $70,000 into the marriage, and if they divorced, she would be entitled to receive that money back, meaning Matt would have to pay her. As one detective observed, murders typically fall into 3 categories: sex, drugs, or money. This case clearly fell into the money category, with 70,000 reasons why Gwen might have been killed. The detective believed Matt did not want to pay that amount. With Gwen dead while still legally his wife, instead of losing money in a divorce, Matt actually stood to gain financially from her death. There was an insurance policy on Gwen, though it was relatively small, approximately $10,000. Matt collected on this insurance policy after her death. The money at stake was not limited to the insurance policy. Detectives discovered there were also real estate issues involving the house Matt and Gwen had previously shared before their separation. Matt possibly needed Gwen's signature to officially sell the property, and perhaps he had been frustrated that she was holding out and refusing to cooperate. While none of this information painted Matt in a favorable light, it was also insufficient evidence to warrant his arrest. As investigators acknowledged, everything they had discovered was speculation and theory, rather than concrete evidence. Theories and suspicions were not sufficient for prosecution. They needed to be able to prove their allegations. Investigators believed they had at least one potential avenue for proof. During Matt's second interview on February 7th, detectives tested his hands for gunpowder residue. The results came back positive. Matt had no known history of owning guns, and no one police interviewed had any knowledge of him using or attempting to obtain firearms. However, to investigator Frazier and Detective Sam, gunshot residue testing was considered unreliable, with experts noting that various factors could cause inaccurate results. This type of testing was not considered sufficiently dependable to hold up in court proceedings. DNA evidence, however, had a much better chance of success in court. Matt had consented to DNA swabs when first questioned, and detectives found that his DNA matched samples on the sweater investigators believed the attacker had likely pulled off as Gwen attempted to escape. However, since Gwen and Matt had been together recently and he had spent time at the apartment, the presence of his DNA on her clothing was not particularly meaningful. So investigators focused their attention on the cigarette butts found outside Gwen's door. Matt's alibi was that he was nowhere near Gwen's apartment when she was killed. If a still-burning cigarette contained his DNA, it would prove he was lying and place him at her apartment at the time of the murder. This seemed to represent their best hope for obtaining physical evidence, and they felt optimistic about the prospects. The cigarette brand, Marlboro Menthol, was the same type that Matt was known to smoke, further raising their expectations. When they received the results, the extinguished cigarette found on the ground did match Matt's DNA. However, the other cigarette that had still been smoldering when discovered contained single-source DNA from an unknown male. Detectives were uncertain what to make of this discovery. Was it possible that Matt had an accomplice, or could this have been a murder-for-hire situation? Matt did not provide any names of people he thought might be responsible for the crime. Outside of Matt, Gwen's loved ones could not identify anyone else who would want to harm her. Gwen was universally described as a wonderful person whom everyone loved. She was kind to everyone, had a generous soul, was funny and charismatic. She was not involved in anything dangerous, did not use drugs, and barely even drank wine. She did not associate with questionable people and lived a completely straight and narrow lifestyle. Gwen lived modestly in a small one-bedroom apartment in West Palm Beach because she was paying her own bills. She was described as a completely innocent victim, clean as driven snow. All she wanted was a husband who would be good and faithful to her. She wanted to have children and create a family. She was characterized as a genuinely good person, which made her murder particularly personal for investigators. When investigators confronted Matt with the fact that his DNA was found on Gwen's sweater and one of the cigarette butts outside her apartment, he denied everything and became agitated. He ultimately left the West Palm Beach police station and never returned. From the first week of February 2003 to the present day, Matt has never contacted any police officer regarding Gwen's case. Detective Sam has encountered Matt on multiple occasions and attempted to have conversations with him, but Matt has never once inquired about what happened to Gwen or expressed interest in seeing her case solved. While not illegal, this behavior revealed something significant about Matt's character and lack of concern for his deceased wife. Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing to Matt, detectives had reached a dead end. Throughout the following years, they continued investigating Matt and his associates, hoping to identify the person whose DNA was on the still-smoking cigarette butt. While police clearly focused primarily on Matt, they also pursued other possibilities. They interviewed Gwen's co-workers, looked for surveillance footage, and canvassed her apartment complex. One tip even took them to Jamaica in pursuit of a teenager, a neighbor who had apparently moved abruptly after Gwen's murder. However, investigator Frazier determined this lead was unrelated, as the young man had simply missed home and wanted to return. Investigators felt they had explored every possible lead and avenue of investigation. As investigator Frazier often commented when Gwen's death came up in conversation, solving the case was simple. They just needed someone to tell them who owned the cigarette butt found on the pole box. Then one day, someone provided a name. It was a name no one recognized: Richard Engel. His DNA had been entered into Cody's approximately a decade after Gwen's murder when he was arrested on federal fraud charges. According to investigator Frazier, Richard also had a violent criminal history, including arrests from 2001 for domestic battery and domestic aggravated assault with a firearm. Richard was serving time in a South Carolina prison on the federal fraud charges. In 2013, Detective Sam and investigator Frazier traveled out of state to interview him. Initially, Richard appeared to assume the detectives were there regarding his fraud case, but they quickly clarified their purpose. During the interview, detectives showed Richard pictures of Gwen's apartment. While he claimed not to recall ever being there, He mentioned that he had lived nearby and used to deliver pizzas in that area, though he noted that all apartment complexes looked similar to him. Richard also stated that he was not a smoker in 2003, claiming he did not develop the habit until later. However, when investigator Frazier posed a hypothetical question about what type of cigarettes he would choose if he were to smoke, Richard responded that he would probably select Marlboro menthol lights. Next, investigators showed Richard a photo lineup of several men, including Matt, and asked if he recognized any of them. Richard said no, denying knowledge of both Matt and Gwen when shown their pictures, stating they did not even look familiar. The detectives then presented the most damning evidence: the cigarette butt with Richard's DNA. When shown a photograph of the cigarette and asked to identify it, Richard correctly identified it as a Marlboro cigarette. When informed that his DNA was on that cigarette, Richard expressed disbelief and claimed he would never have been in that area or committed such an act. Investigators noted that, in their extensive experience, Richard was the first person who had been told that DNA evidence identified them at a crime scene to claim the scientists were wrong. When asked about family members, particularly twins, who might share his DNA, Richard confirmed he had no such relatives. Despite being confronted with the DNA evidence, Richard maintained his innocence and did not attempt to provide any reasonable explanation for why his DNA would be at the scene. He was adamant that he had never been there and continued to deny the scientific evidence. This development led detectives to develop a new theory that Matt Greenblatt and Richard Engel had worked together to commit the murder. They theorized about how the crime might have been carried out, suggesting that both men waited on the third-floor landing, watching the parking lot for Gwen's arrival. Matt would have known definitively when Gwen would be coming home. The case of Gwendolyn Greenblatt remains unsolved more than 2 decades after her murder. Despite extensive investigation, physical evidence including DNA matches, and clear motives involving financial gain and domestic control, law enforcement has been unable to secure sufficient evidence for prosecution. The investigation revealed the complex dynamics of an abusive relationship where Matt maintained control over Gwen even after their separation, using emotional manipulation and financial leverage to prevent her from moving forward with her life. Gwen's decision to finally seek legal counsel and pursue divorce proceedings may have triggered the violent response that cost her life. The discovery of Richard Engel's DNA on the cigarette butt at the crime scene added a new dimension to the case, suggesting the possibility of an accomplice or murder-for-hire arrangement. However, Richard's denial of involvement and lack of apparent connection to either Matt or Gwen has complicated efforts to understand his role in the crime. The case demonstrates the challenges investigators face when dealing with circumstantial evidence, even when it appears compelling. While the combination of motive, opportunity, and physical evidence pointing to Matt seems substantial, the legal system requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, a standard that has not yet been met in this case. Gwen's friends and family continue to seek justice for a woman who was described as genuinely good-hearted and innocent, someone who simply wanted a loving marriage and family. Her death represents not only a personal tragedy, but also highlights the deadly potential of domestic abuse and the lengths to which some individuals will go to maintain control over their victims. The investigation remains active, with law enforcement continuing to hope that additional evidence will emerge or that someone with knowledge of the crime will come forward. Until then, Gwendolyn Greenblatt's murder serves as a reminder of the work that remains to be done in protecting victims of domestic violence and ensuring that those who commit such heinous acts are held accountable for their crimes.